as always, and I know I keep using this pun, but it's a good one, kick off the day with our headlines from our good friend, or my good friend. I love talking to this guy. He gets you thinking. Joseph Kotrie-Monson, who's a criminal defence lawyer, and I'm delighted to say he joins me now. Joseph, I keep using the pun, so I might as well continue with the pun. Let's talk about the whole Gary Lineker thing. And I want to move on to what happens, because people are saying, get rid of him, get rid of him. But I want to look at the legalities of firing somebody over free speech. But first, give me your thoughts on this whole controversy.
Trisha, because I only just got the kick-off pun, but I think you've woken me up in the afternoon on a Sunday now. So, I just thought I'd share that with you. There's so much that's juicy about this, isn't there, Trisha? The legality of the proposed law in the first place, if we can just spend a few seconds on that. The universal opinion. I have to tell you, Trisha, and I'm sure people have read it elsewhere, and it goes without saying once you think about it, among legal experts, is that this law has no chance of standing up in the courts when challenged in its current form. It's in basic...
So we're talking about that... We're talking about the migrants. We're going to kick off with the migrants, right? This is this migration law. And handing millions to France for a law that probably won't work.
Well, if you bear with me for a minute, I mean, basically the idea of deporting somebody and detaining somebody without access to legal advice and the opportunity of a fair hearing, I mean, this is Magna Carta stuff. It's, 800 years old. It's Universal Declaration on Human Rights, 1948. A UN document that we were one of the United Kingdom didn't just vote in favor of it, Trisha. We were actually on the drafting committee. Refugees are specifically protected, irrespective of how they come across borders. Because guess what? Refugees often don't have documents. It's because they're refugees.
Yeah.
Who's actually in the word? Yeah. They often cross borders without documents, irregularly, when they shouldn't, on boats even. The right to legal advice and a hearing if detained and before removal it's basic stuff. No punishment without trial, no removal without lawyers. And then we've got this employment law part of it related to that's surfaced as a result of Gary Lineker's position.
Yeah.
Well, basic rule is this: stopping somebody voice an opinion or some other belief in breach of a basic human right that is enshrined in the European Convention on Human Rights, but has been part of our law for a long time anyway. Right of free speech is something I think that we all pretty much regard that we have, whether you're left-wing or right-wing, whether you're moderate or reactionary, whatever. Most people think that free speech is important. And in fact, in Articles 9 and 10, I guess, of the European Convention, we've got the right to your opinions and your beliefs and the right to express those, okay? Having said...
Joseph, let me just jump in there. I was going to say, because many of us sign, when we sign with a broadcaster, and I know it's different in the BBC, whether you're involved in news and current affairs, that's something else. But you signed that you won't bring the organisation into disrepute. But I always thought that bringing an organisation into disrepute is to sort of, slag off your executive producer or snitch about what's happening in the background, not voicing your opinion about something totally unrelated.
Spot on. And so basically these are not absolute rights. You can't freedom of speech to harass somebody is not an absolute, it's not preserved, for example. Freedom of speech in circumstances where you're a political journalist in an organization that's supposed to be putting out impartial political material, or political information and analysis, well, you would expect that to that extent, the limit of free speech to say whatever you want and to disclose whatever opinions you have, well, that might be regulated or limited. But of course, the argument goes, first of all, he's a sports guy. He's not a political journalist. That's not what he does for the BBC. For him to have opinions outside that, I can't see the circumstances in which people will assume that if he has a political opinion on Twitter when his role in the BBC is sports, that somehow that represents the position of the BBC. I just think that's nuts, because clearly there are other people working for the BBC in sports who have different opinions, and we would have no problem with them exhibiting those. So that's that kind of second strain. There's also been a lot of talk, Trisha, about the fact that he's self-employed technically and an independent contractor, as lawyers might call it, rather than being an employee. Right. I think that's something of a...
Is there a difference?
Well, there is a difference, and the principle of being an employee is that you're essentially under a greater extent controlled by your employer. Somebody who is an independent contractor can decide how to do the work that they're employed to do. I just don't think that's that relevant here, because I'm sure there are certain contractual conditions or presumptions with regard to what he can say and can't say with regard to professionalism, etc. However, there'll be a little Easter egg, a little hook in the tail as we get further into this, because there's one unreported aspect of Gary Lineker's, shall we say, private affairs that may have a bearing on how this is at least viewed. But let's not get into that yet. You have to watch to the end of this segment to get it, people who are watching. Now, so cruel. There's a wider question here, I think. What is politics? What is something that is left and right? What is something that is about political opinion? And what is something something that somebody should, Trisha, be able to talk about? All right. For example, we just had a World Cup in Qatar. There wasn't a BBC journalist who didn't express some opinions about that. Now, that isn't to say, and they weren't particularly controversial opinions. Many people have been highlighting abuses in certain Middle Eastern regimes or whatever. And it's not a particularly controversial topic of discussion. It's still politics, however. There was no such criticism. You quite rightly, Trisha, have also identified these other people.
I'm only going to move on because we're going to be talking about that at length. But here's something that I want to ask you about that's coming up in our faith panel. This whole case of a Catholic bishop or anyone, a Catholic priest. If you are of a certain faith and you're a hospital chaplain, and it's cropped up before in the past, and in this particular case, a gay patient asked, Father, what should I marry my same-sex partner? If you you're employed by a hospital or a bigger organization, somebody asks you something that runs counter to your faith, and you take issue with that person, can you then be brought to task because your job should be bigger than your faith? Should you, in that situation, put your faith or what you passionately believe aside and say, well, this is what I really believe, but this is what I'm employed to do. So I'm going to have to shelve that belief and stick to my contract, so to speak.
Yes.
Is that the way we should be thinking, or should you have freedom of speech there?
I think it depends on the circumstances. You're right, these types of cases have appeared before. There was a celebrated case. I believe it was British Airways was the airline, and it was a flight attendant who had a crucifix on display, and not a particularly aggressive or in-your-face thing to have a small cross around your neck. And that, I think, went all the way to the European Court of Human Rights. And to my memory, she won that case. I think it depends on the circumstances, you know. In practical terms, was anybody harmed? Was anybody likely to be distressed or offended or whatever, you know, from a professional point of view, Trisha, by her having that cross around her neck? Of course not. It was a silly overreaction by the airline. There are other circumstances where things are more involved, and the lines. But there's a point at which you might be treading in the context of your professional work as a result of your beliefs and expressing them in a way that's unprofessional. I think it's very, very fact specific. I think there's so much worry on the part of employers and various organizations that there can be a kind of blunt overreaction to these things. I actually think that...
Yes, we've seen that.
Yeah, and I think now... We've got this massive overreaction to somebody who's saying something that probably most of the population agree with. But I have to say, Trisha, there's one thing that nobody has talked about so far, and it's too much of a coincidence in terms of the timing for us not to at least not mention it and consider it in the spirit of fairness. And that's that this business of whether Gary Lineker is an employee or is an independent agent, an independent contractor, has surfaced only 2 weeks after that very point has been raised by him and his lawyers in an HMRC dispute over tax worth £4.9 million. Now, I'm not saying that that's necessarily significant here. I believe that he's a moral man. The indication is that he's a man of conviction. At the same time, it's quite handy for him that he's able to put his status, and I don't think that's a particularly important point in all of this. I think it's more, as I've said, about freedom of expression and proportionality and whether he's sports or politics. But some people are saying, and it may be that he and his supporters are saying, that this is about whether he's an employee or an independent contractor. Well, it's interesting that that point is now at the forefront of our imaginations at the exact time, or only two and a half weeks later, than his HMRC tribunal documents have been served, litigating exactly the same point.
Only from a lawyer. Joseph, thank you. Thank you for that insight. A very different insight looking behind the legalities behind the headlines today. Joseph Kotrie-Monson, criminal defense lawyer there.